The report I buried is 17 pages long. I know because I counted them the night I printed it. Standing in my kitchen at 2 in the morning in socks and a t-shirt, listening to my printer run while my wife slept upstairs. 17 pages. I folded them twice, put them in a freezer bag, taped the bag to the inside panel of a toolbox I keep in my truck, and I have not touched them since. That was 14 months ago. I am telling you this now because 3 days ago, someone searched my name in the Federal Personnel Database. Not a routine audit. A targeted query. Whoever ran it used a clearance level that does not exist in any org chart I have ever seen. So here is what happened in Montana. Here is what we found. Here is what we made stronger. Make of it what you will. My name is not important. My title on paper is Senior Field Operations Specialist, Department of the Interior, Division of Land and Wildlife Resource Management. That office exists. You can look it up. There is a website with a phone number and a woman named Patricia who answers it and sounds exactly like someone who processes grazing permits all day, because that is what she does. The subdivision I actually work for does not have a website. We operate out of a converted agricultural facility 40 minutes outside of Billings, Montana. The building smells like fertilizer and diesel no matter what season it is. There are 12 vehicles in the lot, all commercial plates, all identical dark green Ford F-250S with the kind of mud on them that suggests regular backcountry use. There is a break room with a coffee machine that has been broken for 3 years and a corkboard with a faded memo about proper bear canister protocol that nobody has taken down because taking it down would require someone to care. We manage population. That is the cleanest way I know to say it. There are things living in the deep wilderness of this country that the biology textbooks have not caught up to yet. Some of them have been here longer than we have. Some of them emerged from conditions that predate recorded history. Most of them are territorial, predictable, and largely self-regulating if you leave the ecosystem alone. Our job is to make sure the ecosystem does not get left alone when it starts producing problems that end up on a county sheriff's desk. I had been doing this work for 9 years when Montana happened. My team at that point was 4 people. Carver had been with the division longer than anyone, 11 years, and he had a habit of referring to whatever we were tracking on a given operation simply as the customer, as though we were providing a service. Diaz was former Army Rangers, quiet in the way that people are quiet when they have decided that most conversation is not worth the energy. Reyes was the youngest of us, 2 years in, and he still laughed at things that the rest of us had stopped finding funny, which was something I had learned to pay attention to because it meant he was still processing normally. I was the team lead. The 4 of us had worked together long enough that the job had developed its own private language. The kind of shorthand that only makes sense to people who have seen the same things and decided, collectively, not to talk about them directly. Carver put it best one afternoon in the parking lot, leaning against the hood of his truck, eating a gas station sandwich, watching me fill out an incident report on a tablet. "You know what I like about this job?" he said, not really asking. I kept typing. "What's that?" "Retirement is going to be real quiet." He said it completely flat. Neither of us smiled. I finished the report, he finished the sandwich, and we drove back to the facility in separate vehicles because that was protocol, and also because neither of us needed to talk about what the report was about. That is who we were. That is the baseline. I need you to feel how normal it was. The briefing happened on a Tuesday. I remember that specifically because Diaz had brought a breakfast burrito from the place on Route 12 that he only ever stopped at on Tuesdays. And he was still eating it when the man in the gray jacket walked in and told us to close our laptops. The man in the gray jacket was not from our division. I did not know which division he was from. I had seen him twice before in my 9 years. Both times preceding operations that generated paperwork I was not permitted to keep copies of. He carried a tablet, always the same model, black case, no agency markings. He spoke the way people speak when they are accustomed to rooms going quiet when they enter them. He pulled up the thermal imaging on the wall screen without introduction. The footage was aerial, drone captured, on 3 nights prior in the Bitterroot Range, roughly 60 miles south of Missoula. At first, the screen looked like any other thermal survey. Dark tree canopy, the gray shimmer of a creek running left to right. The bright signatures of what I assumed were elk moving in a loose cluster near a ridgeline. Then he zoomed in. They were not elk. The heat signatures were wrong for anything in our standard recognition library. Too dense at the core, too hot at the extremities, moving with a lateral weight distribution that suggested something bipedal but wide, heavily built, carrying mass in the shoulders and upper torso the way no natural primate in North America carries mass. There were 7 of them. They were moving in a formation that had no biological precedent I had ever been briefed on. Not a herd pattern, not a predator sweep, a patrol. The man in the gray jacket let us look at the footage for 30 seconds before he advanced to the next slide. The ordnance specifications. Silver-tipped .308 rounds, custom-loaded, brass casings, a specific grain weight I was told not to write down. He explained the mechanism briefly and without warmth. Silver at sufficient velocity and mass creates an ionic disruption effect in certain categories of dense biological tissue. The cellular structure of what we were engaging was documented to respond to silver contact with a measurable breakdown at the membrane level. Enough rounds, concentrated on the core mass, would produce systemic failure within 90 seconds of initial engagement. He said it like he was describing the correct setting for a dishwasher. I did not fully understand the science, and I was not expected to. Next, what I understood was that the rounds had been tested. They worked. We were to go in with 400 rounds per shooter, engage on thermal, confirm neutralization, and extract before first light. Cleanup. That was the word he used. Routine cleanup of a contained biological anomaly. He was closing his tablet when Carver asked about the patrol formation, whether the subjects had demonstrated that behavior previously or whether it was new. The man in the gray jacket paused. Not long. Just a breath's worth of pause that I filed away without understanding why. The formation is new, he said. As of 72 hours ago, they were not doing that. What were they doing 72 hours ago? I asked. Feeding, he said. And then he picked up his tablet and left the room. None of us said anything for a moment. And then Diaz looked down at his breakfast burrito, considered it, and set it on the table. He did not finish it. I have thought about that pause, that single breath of hesitation, more times than I can count. He knew something had changed. He sent us in anyway. That is the part I keep coming back to. That is the part I cannot file away. We inserted at 2200 hours from a Forest Service access road that dead-ended at a locked gate with a no trespassing sign so weathered the text had nearly disappeared. Carver cut the padlock. We drove through, replaced it with one of ours, and left the trucks in a natural depression in the terrain that would hide them from any aerial survey that was not specifically looking. 4 degrees Fahrenheit. No wind. Sky clear enough that the stars were doing actual work, which in other circumstances would have been something to notice and appreciate. We had thermal optics, chest rigs loaded with the silver-tipped ordnance, and enough cold weather gear that movement required intention. You do not flow through a forest in that equipment. You commit to each step, and your body makes decisions slightly ahead of your mind. When we moved in a staggered column, 30 feet between each of us, Reyes on point, Carver at drag, Diaz and I in the middle. The creek the drone footage had shown was approximately 2 miles northeast. We had 4 hours to reach the target zone, engage, and begin exfil before first light turned the tree canopy from cover into exposure. The first thing I noticed was the silence. I want to be precise about this because people use that word loosely. They say a forest was silent and they mean it was quiet. This was not quiet. Quiet is the absence of human noise. What the Bitterroot gave us that night was the absence of every noise. No wind movement in the upper branches. No rodents scatter in the undergrowth. No owl, no distant coyote. Nothing that relocates itself at the sound of 4 humans moving through its territory. A forest at night in Montana in winter still produces sound. Bark contracts in the cold. Ice shifts in creek beds. There are always small things moving in the dark that you never see. There was none of that. The forest was not quiet. It was withheld, like something had asked it to be still, and it had complied. 40 minutes in, Diaz pulled alongside me during a brief hold and spoke at about half volume into the space beside my ear. My left boot is doing that thing again. What thing? The rubbing thing, at the heel. I put the insert in, and it's still doing it. Put a request in with Patricia. I put a request in with Patricia in September. Put another one in. It's December. I know what month it is, Diaz. He dropped back to his position. We kept moving. Neither of us had said a word about the silence. The temperature drop that had nothing to do with elevation change, or the thermal scope readings that had been stuttering irregularly since we crossed the mile marker. When your scope stutters in cold weather, there is a hardware explanation and a not hardware explanation. And in 9 years of this work, I had learned that the not hardware explanation was more common than the manufacturer would like to acknowledge. I did not mention the scope. Nobody mentioned the scope. The trees along the creek approach were where it became harder to pretend. Wind damage in a forest has a grammar. It follows prevailing direction, it hits exposed ridgelines first, it bends younger growth and snaps older deadwood in a pattern you can read like a sentence if you have spent enough time in backcountry terrain. The trees here had been damaged from multiple directions simultaneously, bark stripped at heights between 7 and 11 feet. Some trunks pushed laterally, with a force that had popped the root systems partially out of the frozen ground without fully toppling them, leaving them leaning at angles that looked considered rather than accidental. Not wind. Something else. Something that had moved through here and had not been particularly careful about what it displaced. It was Reyes who stopped. He was on point, 10 feet ahead of me, and he simply stopped walking and looked down at something to the left of the creek bank. He looked at it for 3 full seconds. Then he looked up, looked forward, and started walking again without a word, without a hand signal, without any acknowledgement that he had seen anything at all. And I looked at the spot when I passed it. I kept walking too. We do not need to discuss what was on the ground there. Not yet. But I want you to understand that we all knew, from that moment, that the briefing had been optimistic. We found them at the creek bend, exactly where the drone footage had placed them, as though they had not moved in 3 days and had no reason to. There were 9 of them now. The briefing had shown 7. I registered that discrepancy and set it aside because there was no useful action it suggested, and there was plenty of other information demanding my attention. We were prone in the undergrowth, on a slight elevation above the creek bank, 30 meters of open frozen ground between us and the tree line where they stood. Thermal scopes up. nobody breathing loud enough to matter. The footage had not prepared me for the physical reality of them. On a thermal screen, everything reduces to heat signature, to shape, to movement pattern. Your brain is allowed to keep a certain professional distance. 30 meters in the dark with your own eyes is a different negotiation entirely. They were tall, the shortest among them clearing 7 feet without effort. Built in a way that suggested the skeleton inside had been designed for a different gravity than ours. The shoulders sat too high and too wide. The arms hung with an extra joint's worth of length. And the heads were positioned slightly forward of where a human head sits, giving each of them a permanent attitude of attention, of leaning into something, of already knowing what was coming before it arrived. The skin, if that is the right word for it, had a texture in the moonlight that I can only describe as geological. Not fur, not scales. Something that had the quality of compressed material. Like the surface was several layers deep, and each layer had been added under pressure, and they were not doing anything. That was almost the worst part. 7 of them stood in loose arrangement near the tree line, and 2 others crouched at the creek edge, and none of them were hunting or feeding or moving with any apparent purpose. They were simply present, occupying the space with a completeness that made the forest around them feel like set dressing. Carver's voice came through the earpiece, barely above a murmur. "On your call." I put the first one in my reticle. Center mass, as briefed. The ionic disruption required core penetration, the gray jacket man had said. Core penetration at this range with a .308 was not a question of capability. "Engage," I said. We opened up. The first 2 seconds were textbook. Rounds on target, and the subjects reacting to impact with the physical response you expect from a large organic body absorbing high-velocity projectiles. Movement, disruption of the grouping. The 2 at the creek bank coming upright. I was already cycling for a follow-up shot on my primary target when I saw it. The wound closed. I want to be careful here because I know how that sounds. And I am not interested in sounding like anything other than a man describing what he observed. The entry wound in the upper left chest of the creature I had hit, visible through the thermal scope as a disruption in the heat signature, a dark intrusion into the bright core mass, simply ceased to be a wound. Not instantly. That is the detail that I cannot shake loose no matter how many times I run it through my head. Not instantly. Slowly enough that I watched it happen, and slowly enough that my brain had time to identify what it was seeing, reject it, re-examine it, and accept it. 15 seconds. Maybe 20. The tissue moved. The dark intrusion in the thermal image filled from the edges inward, brightening as it closed. And when it was done, the creature's heat signature was not merely restored. It was larger than it had been before I fired. "Keep shooting," Diaz said. Not a question, not an order, a statement. The way a man states something he is telling himself as much as anyone else. We kept shooting. The engagement lasted 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, I watched the thermal signatures of 9 creatures change in ways that the briefing had given us no framework to process. They were getting hotter. Denser at the core, the bright white of their chest signatures thickening and spreading, and the outlines of their bodies on the thermal scope gaining a clarity and solidity that told me mass was being added in real time. 2 of them that had taken the heaviest fire in the first minute were visibly larger than when we had started. Not dramatically, not monstrously. Just enough that I noticed. And noticing it produced a feeling I had not experienced in 9 years of this work. The feeling was this: we were not hurting them, we were feeding them. One of them turned and looked directly at my position in the undergrowth. Not in the direction of the gunfire, not at the muzzle flash. At me specifically, at the exact elevation and angle where I was lying prone in the frozen scrub. As though it had known I was there before the first shot was fired, and had simply been waiting for me to understand what I was participating in. Carver's voice came through the earpiece one more time. All the professional flatness he had carried for 11 years was gone. What was left underneath it was something much simpler and much older. "It's getting bigger," he said. "Mine is getting bigger." Nobody answered him. There was nothing to say that the scopes were not already saying. The moment I ordered the withdrawal was the last moment I understood what was happening. The formation broke on my order. I want to be clear about that. It was my call. When I saw the thermal signatures expanding, when I understood that the rounds were producing the opposite of their intended effect, I made the decision to pull back to the tree line on our 6 and reassess. That is the correct tactical response to an engagement where your ordnance is not performing as expected. You do not continue an ineffective assault. You withdraw, you regroup, you find a different angle. That is what the manual says. What the manual does not account for is an adversary that registers your withdrawal as an invitation. I called the pullback at the 4-minute mark. Carver acknowledged. Diaz acknowledged. Reyes did not respond immediately, which I noted, and then his acknowledgement came 3 seconds later, which I noted also, and filed in the part of my mind that was still running the operational checklist, even as another part of my mind was doing something it had never done before in 9 years of field work. That other part was trying to find a reason to stop being afraid. It did not find one. We came off the elevated position in a controlled fall back, moving by pairs, Diaz and I first, while Carver and Reyes provided cover, then Carver and Reyes moving while Diaz and I held. Standard leapfrog. I had done it in training hundreds of times, and in the field more times than I had logged, because not everything we did got logged. My body knew the movement without requiring instruction, which was fortunate because the part of my mind that issues instructions was occupied entirely with what I had seen through the scope. The wound closing, whilst the thermal signature expanding, the creature looking at me, not at my muzzle flash, at me. We reached the tree line. I took a position behind a downed log, got my scope up, and swept the creek bank. They were not at the creek bank. I swept left, I swept right. 9 heat signatures had been standing in that clearing 30 seconds ago, and the clearing was now empty in a way that felt less like absence and more like held breath. The thermal scope was stuttering again, the image breaking into static fragments and reassembling. And I did not know in that moment whether the malfunction was hardware or whether it was something the creatures were producing as a byproduct of whatever was happening to their biology. Then Reyes said quietly, from somewhere to my left, "They moved into the canopy." I looked up. Either the thermal scope found them in the branches above the creek, distributed through the upper canopy on both sides of the bank. 7 of them stationary, and 2 still moving laterally through the treetops, with a weight and speed that should not have been possible in trees of that diameter. They had not climbed up there in the 30 seconds of our withdrawal. They had been up there before we opened fire. They had let us see them at the creek bank. They had stood in the open and absorbed our rounds and grown larger, and then relocated above us while we were focused on the clearing. The thought arrived in my mind with a clarity that was almost peaceful. They had managed us. The patrol formation that had been new as of 72 hours ago, the thing the gray jacket man had noted and then declined to explain, was not aggression, and it was methodology. They had a method, and we had walked into it and expended 400 rounds of silver-tipped ordnance feeding it. "Regroup on me," I said into the comms. "Now, move." Carver came through the undergrowth to my right. low and fast, and got behind the downed log beside me. He was breathing hard in a way I had not heard from him in 11 years of his doing this work. He pulled his scope up and looked at the canopy. "How many rounds do you have left?" I asked him. He checked. 60 maybe. 65. Same. I looked at the canopy. One of the creatures had stopped moving and was hanging in the upper branches of a pine tree directly ahead of us with a stillness that was almost meditative. Through the scope, it was brighter than it had been when we arrived. Significantly brighter. The core mass was a hard white on the thermal image, and around the edges of that white there was a luminous bleed that the scope was not designed to render because it had not been designed to look at anything that produced heat at that density. "Don't fire unless I call it." "I wasn't going to," Carver said. Diaz arrived 30 seconds later from the left flank. He came in low, got behind a tree 2 meters from the log, and looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the face a man makes when he has been proven right about something he desperately wanted to be wrong about. I looked past him. "Where is Reyes?" I said. He was behind me. I looked at the tree line we had come through. I looked at the comms indicator on my wrist unit. Reyes's channel was open, the connection active, but there was no sound coming through it. Not static, not interference. Breathing. Long, slow, regular breathing. The kind a man produces when he is making a deliberate effort to control it. "Reyes," I said, low and flat into the earpiece. "Report." The breathing continued for 4 seconds. Then it stopped. Then the channel closed. I looked at Diaz. Diaz looked at the tree line. Neither of us moved for a moment that felt much longer than it was. I thought about what Reyes had stopped to look at on the creek bank during the approach. I thought about how he had looked at it for 3 full seconds and then continued walking without a word. I thought about the way his acknowledgement had come 3 seconds late when I called the pullback, and how 3 seconds in a pullback under fire is enough time for a decision to be made. I think Reyes had understood something that I had not reached yet. I think he had understood it on the creek bank and had spent the rest of the approach deciding what to do with that understanding. I do not know if he made a choice near the end or whether the choice was made for him. I have not let myself decide which of those is worse. The creature in the pine tree moved. It did not drop. It descended, which is a different thing, the distinction being that dropping is a loss of control. And what this thing did was entirely controlled. Branch to branch, with a deliberateness that was almost leisurely, as though it had somewhere to be, and was in no particular hurry about getting there. It reached the lowest branch, perhaps 12 feet off the ground, and it stopped there and it looked at us. Not in our direction. At us. The same specificity of attention I had felt through the scope during the engagement, now without the scope between us. 30 feet of frozen air and nothing else. Its face was not a face I want to describe in detail. I will tell you that it had eyes, that the eyes were forward-facing in the way predator eyes are forward-facing, and that they caught the available light in a way that suggested the mechanism behind them was not the same mechanism behind human eyes. There was processing happening behind those eyes. Active, present, unhurried processing. It looked at Carver. It looked at Diaz. It looked at me. Then it looked back at Carver, and it stayed there. Carver made a sound beside me. Not a word. Just a sound, low and involuntary. The kind of sound a body makes when the mind has stopped managing it. "We need to go," Diaz said. He was not looking at the creature. He was looking at the canopy above it, where the other 8 signatures were still distributed through the branches, still holding, still waiting for something I did not understand and did not want to understand. "We need to go right now." "Carver." I put my hand on Carver's arm. "Carver, look at me." He looked at me. His eyes were fully present, fully functional. This was not shock in the dissociative sense. This was a man who was seeing something clearly and finding the clarity unbearable. "We are going to move south along the tree line toward the access road," I told him. "You are going to stay on my left shoulder and you are not going to look back. Do you understand me?" He held my gaze for a moment. Then he said something he had never said to me in 11 years. "I'm sorry," he said. I'm sorry, I need a second." "You don't have a second." "I know." He exhaled. "I know. Okay. Diaz, south. Move." Diaz moved. I moved with him, Carver on my left shoulder as instructed. I kept my scope up and my eyes forward, and I did not look back because I had told Carver not to look back, and I understood, in a way I had not expected to understand it, that the instruction had been as much for me as for him. We moved south. Behind us in the canopy, I heard the branches begin to shift. Not all of them. Not the rapid movement of a pursuit. A single set of branches, one creature. Relocating slowly and deliberately in the direction we were moving, staying above us and ahead of us, threading through the upper canopy with that same unhurried weight. Not chasing us, guiding us. I understood that too. I filed it in the same place I had filed everything else that night, the place where the things go that your mind accepts, because refusing them requires more energy than you have left. We were 80 meters from the access road when the comms crackled and Carver's channel went to static. I did not stop moving. I did not look back. If I look back in this account, even now, 14 months later, in a kitchen, in a house where my wife is asleep upstairs, I find I still cannot do it. Some doors you leave closed, not because you do not know what is behind them, but because you do. I reached the access road at 0417. I know the exact time because I checked my wrist unit when I saw the gate, and the checking of it was an automatic action, the kind of thing your hands do when your mind has narrowed to a single operational corridor and everything outside that corridor has been temporarily suspended. Time check. Gate visual confirmation. Trucks still in the depression where we left them. Padlock intact. I stood at the tree line for 90 seconds before I crossed the open ground to the vehicles. Not because I heard anything. Because the creature in the canopy had stopped moving at some point in the last quarter mile, and I did not know when. And not knowing when meant not knowing where. Us and crossing open ground without knowing where required 90 seconds of watching the tree line and deciding that waiting longer would not produce more certainty than I already had. I crossed. I got to my truck. I got in. I sat there for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel and the engine off, and I looked at the tree line through the windshield. The trees were trees. The darkness between them was darkness. Nothing moved. The thermal scope was in my lap, and I did not raise it because I had decided, somewhere on the walkout, that there were things I did not need confirmed. I started the engine. I drove. The protocol for a compromised operation with casualties is a direct call to the regional operations desk on an encrypted channel. Voice only, no details beyond a numerical situation code and a location confirmation. I made that call at 0441 from a pull-off on the Forest Service Road, 4 miles from the access gate. The desk picked up on the second ring, which meant they had been awake, which meant they had been awake, which meant they had been waiting, which meant the gray jacket man had already communicated something to someone before we had even reached the target zone. I gave the situation code. I gave the location. The desk read it back to me correctly. "Returning personnel," the desk said. "How many?" "1, I said. A pause. shorter than the gray jacket man's pause in the briefing room, but the same species of pause. The kind that contains information the speaker has decided not to release. "Copy," the desk said. "Proceed to facility. Debrief at 0800. I proceeded to the facility. I sat in the parking lot until 0750. I do not have a clear accounting of that time. The debrief officer was a woman I had not met before. She was perhaps 50, with the kind of composed, unhurried manner that suggested she had conducted a significant number of debriefs and had long ago stopped being surprised by their contents. She had a paper notepad, which I noticed because almost nobody in the division used paper. She had a cup of coffee that she did not offer to share. She had my personnel file open on a tablet, but she did not look at it once during the entire debrief, which told me she had already read it thoroughly enough that she did not need to. She asked about the ordnance performance first, not about casualties, not about the engagement timeline. Ordnance performance, first question, before she had asked me a single thing about the 3 men who had not come back with me. The order of the questions told me everything about what she already knew and what she was primarily concerned with confirming. I answered everything in the operational register. Flat, sequential, professionally detached. I gave her what the report would need to contain. At the 40-minute mark, she looked up from her notepad and asked, in exactly the same tone she had used for every preceding question, "At any point during the engagement, did the subjects demonstrate awareness of individual team members as distinct targets?" I looked at her for a moment. "No," I said. Engagement behavior appeared generalized. No evidence of individual targeting. She wrote something on the notepad. What I did not tell her was this. The creature on the lowest branch had looked at Carver specifically. It had looked at me, it had looked at Diaz, and then it had returned to Carver and stayed there. And Carver, who had worked this job for 11 years and referred to everything we hunted as the customer, and had never once in my presence produced an involuntary sound of any kind, had made a sound and said he was sorry and asked for a second he did not have. Something had passed between that creature and Carver in that moment of sustained attention. I do not know what it was. I know that Carver's channel went to static 80 meters from the road, and I know that he had been on my left shoulder until somewhere in that last quarter mile when he was not. And I did not notice the exact moment of transition because I had been watching the canopy and not watching him. That is the true answer to her question. That is the answer I did not give. She closed the notepad at 0915 and told me the written report was due by end of business. "Standard form," she said. "Operational incident, unspecified threat engagement, personnel losses attributed to hostile contact. Standard form." I wrote it in 2 hours at a desk in the facility that smelled like fertilizer and diesel. I used the word inconclusive 11 times. I listed Carver, Diaz, and Reyes as killed by hostile fire in an unspecified threat engagement, which was close enough to true that my hand did not stop moving when I wrote it. I signed it. I filed it. Then I walked out of the facility, got into my truck, and sat in the parking lot with both hands on the steering wheel and the engine off. I do not know how long I sat there. When I became aware of time again, it was dark. I signed the report and walked out of the building. What came after is harder to file. 14 months. That is how long I've been a person who checks the tree line at gas stations. Not obviously. Not in a way that anyone standing at the next pump would register as unusual. Just a habit that developed somewhere between Montana and now. The same way you develop any habit gradually and without a clear point of origin, until one morning you realize you have been doing it for so long that not doing it would feel like leaving the house without your keys. The toolbox is still in the truck. I have not opened it. I do not intend to open it until I have decided what opening it is for, and I have not made that decision yet. There are smaller things. I used to sleep with the bedroom window cracked, regardless of season. My wife liked the air movement, and I had never had a reason to feel differently about it. I closed it for the first time the week I got back from Montana, and I have not opened it since. She asked about it once, early on. I told her the cold was bothering me. She accepted that. She is a practical woman who does not require complete explanations for minor behavioral changes, which is one of the reasons I married her, and one of the reasons I have not told her anything about the real report in the toolbox. I think about Carver more than I think about Diaz or Reyes. I am not sure that is fair to Diaz and Reyes, and I have not resolved it. What I think about specifically is what he said in those last seconds behind the downed log. Not the apology, which I understood. The other part, the part where he said he needed a second. 11 years in this work, and that was the thing that finally found the edge of him. Not the rounds closing over, not the thermal signatures expanding. The sustained attention of something that had decided, for reasons I will never know, that he specifically was worth looking at. I think about what it saw when it looked at him. I think about whether it found what it was looking for. 3 days ago, I was filling the truck at a gas station 12 miles from my house, the one on the county road that sits at the edge of where the residential grid gives out and the timber country begins. I was watching the tree line the way I always watch the tree line, and I was not seeing anything because there was nothing to see. Just tree line, just timber, just the ordinary dark between ordinary pines. Then one of the pines moved. Not in the way trees move in wind. There was no wind. It moved the way the canopy had moved above us during the withdrawal from the creek. That single, deliberate lateral relocation, one tree to the next, something redistributing its weight through the upper branches with a patience that had no urgency in it, because urgency implies the possibility of failure. I stood at the pump. I watched the tree line. The tree line watched me back. Then I replaced the nozzle, got in the truck, and drove home. I made dinner. I ate it at the table across from my wife. We talked about ordinary things. The bedroom window is still closed. If this account found you, it was meant to. There is more in the toolbox than the report. I left something else in there the night I printed the 17 pages. A photograph from the drone footage the gray jacket man showed us in the briefing. Not the thermal imaging. The photograph taken 11 seconds before the thermal imaging began, when the drone's optical camera was still running. In that photograph, at the edge of the frame, standing in the tree line above the creek, there is a figure that does not appear in any of the subsequent thermal footage. It is the right height and the right build. It is wearing a field jacket with a division patch I recognize. I have not decided what to do with that yet. If you have seen anything in the deep timber, if you have filed a report that came back inconclusive, if someone in a gray jacket has sat across a table from you and asked questions in the wrong order, you know how to find this account again. Leave the window closed. You just heard a classified account that was never meant to leave a toolbox in a truck parked outside a building that smells like fertilizer and diesel. If that story did something to you, sit with it for a moment. That feeling is the point. If you want to be here when the next account surfaces, subscribe now. Hit the bell. Because the next one is already written and it goes somewhere this one deliberately did not. If you watch this far, you already know you are the kind of person this channel is for. Leave a comment telling me the moment this story stopped feeling like fiction to you. I read every single one.